Hi, we just released a new plugin last week, and it's called Multiband. It's a plugin that splits a single audio signal into up to 4 different bands and sends each band out on a separate bus. So it's a free app. If you use iOS and you make music, iOS, meaning iPad OS or iPhone OS, and you make music on it, you should go and download it. I'll put the link in the description. But after we released this plugin, some customers asked a very interesting question. And the question was, why do we even need this? Because can't I just take my audio and copy it onto 4 different channels or 4 mix buses, and then just use low pass and high pass filters with a standard EQ, and I can separate into bands and everything's okay, and then I don't need your plugin, right? So it's a good question, it's a fair question, and it's actually a very interesting question. So today I want to talk about why splitting an audio signal into separate frequency bands is not as simple as it looks. And in order to do that, I'm going to use Isotope RX, and you see it on my screen. I'm going to generate 30 seconds of white noise on both the left and right channels. So you've got it here, left and right channels having white noise. And this is my spectrum analyzer, and you can see that these 2 signals are flat spectrum, 2 within plus or minus 1 dB or so. What that actually means is kind of complicated, so I'm going to leave it at that. The spectrum analyzer looks flat, right? We'll say no more about that. And now what I want to do is I want to filter the left channel and the right channel, and I'm going to use different filters on each channel. So I'm going to high pass filter on the left channel. Let's get some filters up here. Get a high pass on, low pass off, process that, and have a look at the spectrum. There it is. I've lost the low frequencies from the left channel. Now I'm going to go to the right channel, and I'm going to turn off the high pass filter, turn on the low pass filter. This is a 24 decibel per octave low pass filter. I'm processing it. Both of these filters had the same cutoff frequency at 1500 hertz, and here's the spectrum. So you can see that indeed the signal remains flat in the pass band. It starts to slowly come down, and when we hit 1500 hertz, which is the cutoff frequency, it's down by 3 dB in both the left and the right channels. And then there's this transition region where they're because they can't go from being loud to being nothing immediately in a really narrow frequency range. So there's a transition band here, but other than that, things look pretty good. This looks like a good frequency separation. If we look in the time domain, we can see that the left and right channels have lost some volume just because the wave isn't as tall. But we see the right channel lost a lot more volume than the left channel did, and the reason for that is that my cutoff frequency is at 1500 hertz, and my sample rate is 48 kilohertz, which means that from 1500 down to 0, I've got 1500 hertz bandwidth of equal energy. So my left channel, my right channel is the blue one. My right channel contains this equal power signal from 0 hertz up to about 1 kilohertz. But my right channel, on the other hand, left channel, on the other hand, maybe I said that wrong the first time. Anyway, this channel here that I'm pointing to, which is the white one in the graph, goes from 1500 all the way up to 24 kilohertz. So although on the graph it looks like the transition, the cutoff frequency is in the middle, that's because of the way they drew the graph. In reality, 1500 is not halfway between 0 and 24,000, obviously. So because it's not halfway, therefore one channel lost more energy than the other. But no matter, the important thing for this exercise we're doing now is that in the pass band, the volume is the same, and it comes down near the transition band. Okay, so we're okay up to there, except I made a mistake. I'm going to have to back up. I generated this signal in stereo, but because this is random white noise, the 2 channels do not contain the same data. And if I want to demonstrate a frequency splitter, what happens when you split frequency on a signal, it's really important that I'm splitting the same signal. It can't be two different signals. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to use this mixing tool to mix the right channel into the left channel and the left channel into the right channel, each one at 100%. And when I get done, you will see, didn't work. What went wrong? 100%, 100%. I didn't select both channels. There we go. Let's select all the channels, process them all. And now you see on the spectrum graph, you only see one line. And that's because the left and right channels now contain exactly the same signal. So we're going to go back and do our EQ again. I'm going to low pass on one channel, process that. I'm going to high pass on the other channel and process that. And when we go back into the spectrum view, everything looks good. Right. So up to here, everything is looking good, but here's where it gets weird. These filters have not only changed the volume, but they've also shifted the phase of these two signals. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that means, but if you imagine that these signals are, they're waves. So if you imagine a sine wave, this isn't a sine wave, it's noise, but imagine a sine wave because it's easy to imagine. If you have one wave in the left channel and another wave in the right channel, and the one in the left channel is up when the one in the right channel is down, and then the right goes up and the left is down, and they're always opposite each other, we would say they are out of phase. If you take those two signals and you add them back together when they're out of phase, they will subtract from each other, they'll cancel each other out, and you'll get a dead spot at the transition region. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix these two things back together, and let's look at what happens. So what I'm going to do, this is important to pay attention to this because it's kind of tricky. I'm going to take the left output is going to be 100% of the left plus 100% of the right. So in the left channel, I'm going to add these two. And in the right channel, I'm going to subtract them. So what's going on, once again, is I have two channels here. I'm going to mix these two channels up. And in the output, the new output that I'm going to get, this left channel will be both of these added together. These two things added together, that'll be the left channel. And the right channel of my output will be these two things subtracted. So let's do it. Let's select everything. Select everything, process that, and it looks okay, but let's have a look at that spectrum. Lo and behold, it did not work. So the blue line is the one where I subtracted. And when I subtracted these two, they got this dead spot in the middle where in the transition range between the two signals, I lost a lot of volume. And I lost volume because the filters are shifting the phase, not completely out of phase to where I lost nothing, which is a little strange because I thought it should be. But anyway, they've shifted the phase so that I lost looks like 12 dB of volume in the transition region when I subtracted the signals. But when I added the signals, instead of losing volume in the transition region, I actually added about, what was that, 3, 4 dB of extra volume. So I'm going to back up here. When I EQ'd, it looked like this. This looks good. It looks like I should be able to add these back together and things are going to go well. But in reality, regardless of whether I add them or subtract them, this transition region does not come out to be flat spectrum. And so that, my friends, is why you need a plugin to do frequency splitting. Now, we should say it is absolutely possible that your EQ might be able to do this correctly because the plugin does it correctly, right? And the plugin is just a filter. It's not doing magic. If your EQ is the right kind of EQ curve, it will work. Unfortunately, the default EQ curves that most EQs are using are not going to work because they're not designed for this. It's not that there's anything wrong with them. That just isn't what they were designed for. So it turns out that if you want this to work, what you need is a special type of filter, and there are a number of different types of filters that will work for this. An interesting thing we could try is we might see what happens when we use these digital filters. Let's give that a try. So I'm going back. I now back to my flat spectrum. I'm going to take a digital style filter, which is an FIR filter. I'm going to do that on the left channel. That looks good. Let's do it to the right channel with the low pass. Got that. Everything looked good so far. Let's mix it back together. So this didn't work either. Right, so that's not surprising. Nothing wrong with these filters. Isotope didn't make a mistake when they designed them. It's just that these weren't designed for doing frequency splitting. So there are certain special filters which are designed so that when you split a signal apart and then you put it back together, you do get back a flat spectrum. And there's nothing magical about these filters. They're not particularly difficult to build, but if you don't use those type of filters, this won't work. And so that's what our plugin is doing. It's just using a specific type of filter that's designed to make sure that the phases line up so that when you put everything back together, it comes out nicely and you get a flat spectrum. If you're really curious or you wanted to mess around with this yourself, one of the filters that you can use that does work is if you have a low pass and high pass filter pair with adjustable Q. If you set the Q to 0.5 on both the low pass and the high pass, this will often work. When I say often, the one problem is that often the filters will be inverting the high pass, so that the phase on the high pass will be opposite of the low pass after you finish filtering. And then you're still going to get this dip. So in order to, like, if you wanted to make your own version of this plugin that I'm talking about, this multiband plugin, using an EQ and a mix bus, you would probably need, first of all, an EQ with adjustable Q on the low pass and high pass filter, and you'd want to set it to 0.5. And then you might also need a phase inverter on one of the channels so that you could switch between this sum channel and the difference channel to find, because one of them is going to give you a flat spectrum. Usually the difference, I think, would give you a flat spectrum, but the sum wouldn't. But it depends what, it depends how the filters have been designed. So I'm using a software called Mathematica, and that's what you see on your screen right now. And this software is a mathematical prototyping software. You can see this isn't very complicated. Oh, it might look complicated to you, but I mean it's less than 25 lines of code. So what I've got here is the transfer function of the biquad filter, which is just a standard default second order filter transfer function. It works for a whole lot of different filters. And then I have a low pass filter with adjustable Q, high pass filter with adjustable Q, and some plotting functions just to plot the frequency response of these filters. So what you're seeing on the screen right now, the green line is a low pass filter, blue line is a high pass filter, and the pink line is what we get when we low pass a signal, then we make another copy of the signal and we high pass it, and then we merge those signals, summing them back together. And so what you see here is that the volume, when you put these two signals back together, has a dead spot in the middle where it actually goes down to, theoretically, all the way down to 0 dB at this transition frequency between the two frequency bands. So just to explain the graph a little bit, this left side is the volume in decibels, and the top is frequency, but it's not measuring frequency in hertz, it's measuring in radians. So it may look a little strange because that's not the way we usually display frequency in audio software. The reason for doing this is so that we don't have to worry about the sample rate, so it's just a generic model that works in any sample rate. So I have these two sliders that I can move in this prototype. So I'm adjusting the cutoff frequency between the low band and the high band, and then this adjusts the Q of the filters. So typically when we do just want a default style filter, usually I set the Q to be about 0.71, which happens to be the square root of 1/2. or 1 over square root of 2. And it's called we call this a Butterworth filter, named after the person who discovered the equations that, that define it. And the reason that we typically use that filter is because it has the very flat, it has the longest flat frequency response in the passband. In other words, like if I set the cutoff frequency at 1500 hertz, that Butterworth filter has the widest region of frequencies that just stay untouched. The volume remains constant below the cutoff frequency of the low-pass filter. So for that reason, that tends to be the filter that we use by default when we're not thinking about phase shifts and more complicated things that can go on when you're doing filtering. So as we adjust the Q, if we increase the Q, we get these resonant peaks, and you can see that happening with the green and blue lines. Doesn't do a whole lot to the pink line, changes the shape, I guess, but doesn't cure the dead spot problem. Or if we reduce the Q, these filters don't have that flat pass band anymore. Now they kind of curved all the time from the bottom up to the top. But as I said before, we tend to use default Q on low pass, high pass filters at about 0.7 something, which is the square root of 1/2. So the first thing that we would need to do if we wanted to design a pair of filters to be used for splitting frequencies is we need to get rid of this dead spot. And the way to do that is pretty easy. Instead of adding the two filters, you have to subtract them. So you invert one of them. And now you see it's working a lot better. I've got my low pass here, I've got my high pass here, and when I put them back together, I get something that's kind of flat, except it has this hump in the middle at the transition band. And so I fix this hump just by adjusting the Q. So if I just take the Q down a little bit, you can see it's getting flatter, it's getting flatter, it's getting flatter. And when I hit, it should be exactly 0.5. There it is. You can see I can type it in and make it exact. When the Q is exactly 0.5 for both the low pass and the high pass, now I get a perfectly flat frequency response when I do the frequency separation and then put the bands back together. And so there are other ways to do it, but this is one way of designing a pair of filters that does a frequency split like that and does it correctly in a way where you get back your original frequency response after you do all the processing and put everything back together. So just to review, in order to get this flat spectrum, when I use EQ filters to split into two bands, low and high, and then put them back together, I had to do two things. First of all, I had to set the Q to 0.5, and secondly, I had to subtract the two signals instead of adding them. Or another way of saying this is that the filter I was using for the high pass filter was inverting the phase at the transition band, and I need to flip the phase back so that the transition band doesn't invert like that. And that solves the problem. Now as I said before, there are a lot of other filters we could use. We didn't have to use second order filters. We could use fourth order filters. We could use FIR filters. There are a whole lot of other ways to do this. But this is just a quick example of one way that it works that's easy to see. There's one more issue that we have to deal with that we haven't talked about here, and that is if you're not splitting into two bands, but you're splitting into 3 bands or 4 bands, then you're going to need more than just 2 filters. And the interaction of the phase shifts between 3 filters or 4 filters will get considerably more complicated than it is when you just have 2. And so, like what I've just shown you here, this might work okay if you're just trying to split bass and treble. If you have an EQ, you can set the Q with adjustable Q, and you can set the Q to 0.5, and it's a second order filter, and you have the cutoff frequencies at the right place, and you invert the phase on one of them. Everything would work for that two band split. But if you wanted to go to a 3-band split, I'm not saying you can't do it, I'm just saying you would be looking at a very complicated setup. in your digital audio workstation to try to use ordinary EQ to do frequency splitting. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Just thought some people might be interested in knowing why you shouldn't use an EQ to split off low and high frequencies, unless of course you're not going to put them back together. Like, there's nothing wrong with filtering out the high frequencies and throwing them away, but you definitely don't want to filter out the high frequencies, then make a copy of the signal, filter out the low frequencies, and then try to put the two signals back together later. And I think we'll stop there. Check out the plugin on the App Store. It's free, so there's no reason I can think of why you shouldn't download it. One more thing. If you like this kind of information, hit subscribe so that you can see more of our videos as they come on the App Store. And we'll see you in the next video.